Welcome as we explore the history of male pattern baldness. Welcome to the history of the Eastern Roman Empire, aka the Byzantine Empire. So, when we last left off, the Roman Empire was pretty big. Problem is, it got too big for its britches. Yes, that is the scholarly term for the concept. And it had to be partitioned to make it more manageable. The empire gets partitioned several different times. I didn't go over every single time that it gets partitioned, but by the time you get to the Emperor Constantine, that division between East and West more or less becomes permanent. So you have a powerful and mercantile Eastern Roman Empire, and then you have the Western Roman Empire. And we talked about why, in a lot of ways, the Eastern Roman Empire was actually more powerful than the Western Roman Empire, even though it didn't actually have the city of Rome. Now, with those political divisions, those also overlap with cultural and religious divisions. That shouldn't be surprising. Usually one generally leads to the other. So first there were the political divisions, and again, those political divisions were mostly administrative, but also the Western Roman Empire is the part of the empire that has Rome, the birthplace of the Latin language and the Latin people as an independent cultural group. The Eastern Roman Empire, let's be real, it's not all that Roman. Latin is not native to that area. Greek is native to that area. And of course, the Greek people have a very powerful and vibrant culture that was spread because of Hellenism under Alexander the Great. You could kind of argue that the Greeks gave the Romans more of their culture than the Romans gave the Greeks Roman culture. So you have the foundation for some very significant differences down the line. Increasingly, the leader of the Western Church was the Bishop of Rome, later just called Popa, and eventually just Pope, meaning basically father. So basically, the leadership of the Western Church was held by, a priest. In the Eastern Church, it's held by these religious figures called patriarchs, also basically meaning father, but their position, their appointment is based upon the support of the emperor, the Eastern Roman emperor. So let's skip forward just a little bit. So 324, Constantine builds his capital, Constantinople, because he's a very humble dude like that. And a little over 100 years later, about 150 years later, the Western Roman Empire falls. Attack of Rome occurs in 476, and so this kind of creates this permanent division between East and West. So in the East, Constantinople is the capital. Some might even say the city. The city of Constantinople, from this point up until really the middle of the 1800s, is one of the most populous cities in the world. Well over 200,000 people for most of that time period. And if Egypt is the gift of the Nile, Constantinople is the gift of the Bosporus Straits. So there's this little tiny passage right here that connects the Black Sea to basically what this sea is right here, the Sea of Marmara. And then you get the Aegean Sea right here, and then you got the general Mediterranean Sea. There's a lot of trade that goes through these straits. If you look to the north, you can't really see it, but you have Ukraine, and Ukraine has historically been a breadbasket for much of the rest of the world, sort of along with Egypt. And even non-Ukrainian trade, just trade along the Silk Roads, etc., a lot of it flows into that area. So there's a lot of commerce that flows through Constantinople, both from the sea passage, but also you have a land bridge that connects Europe with much of the rest of Asia. So Constantinople is one of those boardwalk pieces of property in the great real estate game of trade. Is one of those things that if you want to dominate trade routes, you absolutely have to have. Also, because it's on a peninsula, is very easy to fortify. Constantinople had double walls. And so even though Constantinople is besieged by many of Rome's same enemies, like the Germanic tribes, the Goths, Visigoths, etc., they just aren't able to really contend with those double walls. I mean, the Huns try to attack the Byzantines, and they're like, well, we have horses. Maybe we can get Horsey to jump over wall. That doesn't work. Well, and then they ride off. Constantinople is a very tough nut to crack. Now, the fortunes of the Eastern Roman Empire ebb and flow. At its greatest extent, it even rivals the size of the unified Roman Empire, which, I mean, is quite an accomplishment. At its weakest, it basically exists only as a city-state, or sometimes it exists as a state that only occupies a small amount of territory on either side of the Bosporus Straits. But no matter what, even when its back is pressed against the wall, and it is periodically, the fact is that Constantinople is just so darn well defended that even when the chips are down, the Eastern Roman Empire tends to survive and thrive. Now, when the Roman Empire basically outsources itself to Constantinople in the East, there's still a lot of Roman culture that is preserved. I mean, these are Roman elites that are, leading the charge to build this large city in an area that has historically been pretty Hellenized. I know that this is an area that is nowadays occupied by, it's Turkish territory nowadays. The Turkic people, as we know them, or the Turkish people as we know them, they haven't quite arrived yet. So this is an area that's more influenced by Greek civilization, and if you want to be like really specific, Thracian civilization, but we don't have to get that specific. So you do see the retention of things like the Latin language for a while, the preservation of things like Roman roads, Roman customs like having chariot games, Roman dress, also, of course, the Christian religion, which was heavily associated with Rome. And finally, and maybe most significantly, the Latin language, because remember, the Latin language is not native to that area. The Eastern Roman Empire kind of redefines itself with the ascension of Mr. Fancy Hat Man, Justinian. Justinian is, if there's any emperor that anyone knows about, associates with the Eastern Roman Empire, is going to be Justinian. I don't know that I would say he's the most significant Byzantine ruler, but he's up there. So Justinian, the TLDR, he has a mission. And his mission is to basically reconstitute the Roman Empire in all its glory. And, I'll give the guy some credit. He comes very close to achieving that goal. When Justinian comes to the throne, the Eastern Roman Empire is locked into a life and death struggle with the Sassanid Empire, which is basically another iteration of the Persian Empire. And by the way, that might seem kind of melodramatic, but to be honest, that's just, an East Roman Tuesday. The East Roman Empire is always locked into a life or death struggle with some kind of Persian state. But not only does that campaign kind of come to a close, Justinian turns his attention to the West. He basically takes North Africa, or retakes North Africa from a series of tribes, the Vandals and the Ostrogoths, who, believe it or not, these are Germanic people that during the collapse of the Roman Empire, they had invaded North Africa, which had been controlled by the Romans. Now Justinian sends a very talented general by the name of Belisarius and his sidekick Narses. He sends them first to North Africa, and then eventually he sends them to Italy itself. Now, they actually do manage to reconquer the city of Rome. Then they kind of realize that Rome sort of sucks. But, I mean, hey, it's kind of nice. I mean, the Roman Empire actually has Rome back. So it's no longer a case of serious false advertising. Now, unfortunately, none of these military conquests were going to be very permanent. Part of it is that in the middle of his reign, a plague sweeps the Eastern Roman Empire, and we now know that it's caused by, dun dun dun, the bubonic plague. The second version of it that we've talked about, remember, it famously debuts during the Peloponnesian War, which ends up killing a bunch of Greek people. Now it's famously debuting during the reign of Justinian, where it kills a bunch of Greek people. History repeats itself, but rarely does it repeat itself so, specifically. Anyway, this radically reduces the population of the Eastern Roman Empire, at least for a time. It means that the conquests are eventually, slowly but surely, sort of rolled back. So Justinian is the last Eastern Roman emperor who has ambitions to reunify the empire, and actually goes a long way to do that. Okay, so the other thing that we associate with him is the preservation of Roman law and an expansion of it in the what's called the Code of Justinian. So this is also to kind of streamline imperial administration. Justinian, as you can kind of tell, he's kind of an organizer. And he's obviously somebody who is extremely focused on building projects, especially this building project. You have seen this before, even if you don't know it. So let's go say hi to Sophia, specifically the Hagia Sophia. So the Hagia Sophia is currently a mosque. It was transformed into a mosque when the Ottoman Turks take the city in, spoiler, 1453. But during this time period, it's an Eastern Orthodox church. In fact, it is the center of Eastern Orthodox worship for really the Orthodox world. The minarets, that is an addition when the Turks come in, because minarets are something we associate with Islam. But, I mean, take a look at that. That's pretty swanky, even for extremely swanky churches. Okay, now let's go back and talk about number 4. This is incredibly significant. So we said that Latin was still the ruling language of the Roman Empire, but then what happens is that when Justinian sends troops to reunify the Roman Empire, he discovers that all the people who speak Latin now natively are all of these hairy barbarians living in places like Italy and France with abhorrent body odor and weird sort of religious beliefs. And so there's that association with Latin as being the language not of imperial administration, not of the ruling elite, but of stinky, hairy barbarians. I feel attacked here. So, in what might be kind of a concession to the inevitable, Justinian makes Greek the official language of the Eastern Roman Empire. I say that it might be a concession to the inevitable because, again, you basically stick a city smack dab into the middle of Greek land. Like all of this land is occupied or settled by Greek-speaking people. And so you can kind of imagine that it might be unrealistic to expect Latin to continue as being the dominant language of the Eastern Roman Empire. But there's also like some snobbery involved. Like Greek, even during the Eastern Roman Empire, or sorry, even during the time where Rome was a united empire, Greek was considered a language of the educated upper class. So this is a way for the Eastern Romans to distinguish themselves from what they perceived as their less educated, more sort of redneck brethren in the West. And if you feel like there's some cultural condescension going on here, you'd be right. The Eastern Empire and the new Christian kingdoms in the West, like, there's not a lot of love lost between them. So when we look at the Eastern Roman Empire's political system, we see a fair amount of continuation from the Roman Empire, especially the later Roman Empire. Remember, this is not the Rome of the Republic, where the Senate is in the driver's seat. This is a Roman Empire where the emperor's authority is seen as paramount. So in some respects, I would argue that Roman emperors become more powerful than they even were during the later part of the Roman Empire. Basically, during like the pre-Christian Roman Empire, emperors had religious authority. They were usually considered like chief priests or something like that, and they would be divinated, given divine status after they died, but they weren't necessarily considered divine in and of themselves, at least while they were alive. And some weren't considered divine at all if they were unpopular with the Senate. With the Eastern Roman Empire, however, let's say that the empire is a lot more autocratic, and one reason for that is that emperors from Justinian onward claim that they have been ordained and selected by God. This is kind of an early version of the divine right of kings that we'll talk about a little bit later, that we associate with European rulers in the 17th and 18th centuries. The Byzantines are kind of pre-gaming that. The fact that the emperor spoke for the government and the church is a concept called Caesaropapism. Gesundheit, right? That's something, your homework, by the way, is to use that casually in conversation with your friends at some point. The emperor of the Eastern Roman Empire was considered both the head of the church and the head of the government. Now, you might ask, what about the Pope? That's one of those points where the less said about that, the better. Both represented, or both claimed that they spoke for the authority of the entire Christian church, but in practice, what the Eastern Roman Emperor said went in Roman lands, and the Pope was going to be more influential in places like Italy, France, parts of Spain, etc. Now, the Eastern Roman Empire is a very centralized state with an exceedingly powerful ruler. So this is going to require a bureaucracy that is similarly or proportionally large and complex. So this shouldn't really be any major surprise. It's not unlike the bureaucracy that we see emerging in ancient China. And in fact, there are some parallels. The bureaucrats of the Eastern Roman Empire had to be educated in things like Greek classics, which is not all that different from the humanistic education of the Confucian bureaucrats back in the day. But this bureaucratic system where you have the emperor, you have his bureaucracy, and then, of course, you have local elites that kind of ruled the empire empire's provinces. This very confusing system actually gives rise to how we use the word Byzantine today. Byzantine is not just an adjective that refers to the Eastern Roman Empire. The word Byzantine refers to something overly complex, convoluted. So it's perceived to be an incredibly bloated and complex bureaucracy. Now, on the one hand, there are some parallels with what's going on in Western Europe. You have hereditary military leaders and soldiers that are given land for their trouble. This sounds a lot like European-style feudalism, but there's also a lot of differences. One, let's just say that the power of the emperor was much more autocratic than the power of any European king. No European king could speak for both the government and the church. The Eastern Roman Emperor most certainly did. Also, is the fact that the Eastern Roman army wasn't a feudal army. So when we get to feudalism in the next unit, we'll talk about how basically in feudal armies basically consisted of heavily armored and extremely competent and capable warriors called knights who were trained to fight almost as like individuals. And then you basically had like a bunch of peasants with pitchforks, at least for a lot of the Middle Ages. Whereas in the Eastern Roman Empire, like the Eastern Roman army was still recognizably the army of the old Roman legions. Like the armor was different, some of the tactics were different, they focused a lot more on cavalry, that sort of thing. But this was a professional army. And oftentimes it would be a professional army that would swear loyalty to military commanders. And actually, just like the old Roman Empire, you do have periods of time in the history of the Byzantine Empire where charismatic and or successful generals or governors will conspire against the emperor, especially if they perceive the emperor to be weak. So, Eastern Roman culture and society. So we've already seen a good bit of it. We can say that it's incredibly creative. And as you can kind of see, like it influences later Islamic and more broadly Arabic architectural styles as well. But if there's something that you kind of associate with Byzantine art, it's the fact that Byzantine art wins a lot of staring contests. Like, look at these people. It's like they're staring into your soul. Yeah, that goes for you too, Baldy. So we associate a lot of art as being icon paintings that are paintings of saints or religious figures, and they're typically these richly colored mosaics. Now, mosaics were pretty important and significant in the Roman Empire as well, but the Byzantines sort of perfect the style, and of course they make it much more religious. This isn't all that different from Christian Europe, where almost all art that is produced has some kind of religious significance or application. So the thing about these icon paintings is that they're all the craze in the Eastern Roman Empire until they're not. Eventually, in and around, I think the 9th or 10th century CE, maybe a little bit later, eventually there's the argument that's made that icon paintings that are prayed to or venerated is basically the equivalent of idolatry, and because a lot of the Old Testament is basically see Israelite king worshiping idol, see him get struck by lightning for worshiping idol. Well, the Eastern Roman Empire decides to, be on the safe side, and there's a lot of these icon paintings that are destroyed as a consequence. So, a win for the Eastern Orthodox Church, I guess, but a loss for art and art history. As you might imagine, The culture of the Eastern Roman Empire was a fair split between Hellenism and Orthodox Christianity. This is an area where Greek classics like the Iliad and Greek philosophy are still studied, but you also have the infusion of Orthodox Christianity. Now, women were denied lots of their freedoms and confined to their home. There was typically a lot more freedom reserved for upper class women. In fact, probably the best overall account that we have of life in the Eastern Roman Empire is written by the daughter of the Emperor Alexius, Anna Comnena, who lives, I think, in the 11th century CE. But in general, what you kind of see is almost a reversion to how women were treated in classical Greece. We talked about the fact that in classical Greece, women were sort of expected to basically have lives that were entirely separate from that of their husbands. They were supposed to stay indoors. And we also talked about, how a lot of the traditions surrounding, women covering their bodies actually has lots of roots in Greece. This is a big shift away from how women were treated in the Roman Empire. The Romans were a little bit more equitable in how they treated men and women. Still incredibly unfair, but men and women were supposed to be more partners than let's say, then have a master-servant relationship. Whereas, for the most part, in the Eastern Roman Empire, it kind of reverts to those old traditions. So the only women who really exercised power to a great extent were women, were royal women, excuse me. We do have a few cases of female rulers in the Byzantine Empire, most notably the Empress Irene. She rules in the 9th century CE. But most famously is the wife of Justinian, Theodora. And depending upon which account you believe, Theodora was either, earlier in life, a circus performer or a prostitute, perhaps both. So, you do see a kind of rags to riches story. And Theodora apparently, I think as my mama would put it, she had Justinian wrapped around her little finger. She was very influential in imperial politics. Belisarius, that very famous general that recaptures Rome, he basically gets semi-exiled because he falls out of the favor of Theodora. So women could still wield quite a bit of power behind the scenes, but that's really the only type of power that we see them exhibit in the Eastern Roman Empire. So if political power was superficially similar to feudal Europe, economically, it was entirely different, partially because the economy was more or less centrally managed. In the European economies, you didn't really have anything like consistent coinage or that kind of thing. Whereas in the Byzantine Empire, you see the old Roman tradition carried forward of emperors minting their own coins. So at first, Byzantine coins were either gold or bronze, but by the end of the empire, they become silver and copper. It's basically how you get inflation with an economy that's based upon specie, or in other words, precious valuable metals. So the economy is still agrarian. It's basically a large peasant class that grows subsistence crops. Now, one interesting continuation of the Roman Empire is the fact that, like Rome, Constantinople was a city with an absolutely enormous population. Not as large as Rome at its height, but that says more about Rome than it does about Constantinople. The population of Constantinople was consistently in the 6 digits throughout almost its entire existence. So the question comes or becomes, how can you feed that city? At first, well, you know, if you know anything about Anatolia, Anatolia is very rugged and very mountainous. So is Greece. These are areas that are wealthy, but not really the best places to grow crops. So you do have parts of the empire that are better at growing crops. Most notably, you've got Egypt. Now, the problem, of course, is that with the emergence of Islam in the 7th century CE, eventually Egypt gets conquered by successive caliphates. It's lost to the Byzantines. So it's not able to pull grain from that area. So the alternative is to rely upon, basically, areas of Ukraine to trade with, which is, again, as we mentioned, it's one of the breadbasket areas of Europe. So this means that the Byzantine Empire becomes dependent upon a long-distance trade, not just for its economy, but for its very existence. That being said, the empire was also incredibly wealthy in terms of luxury goods. They copy Chinese silk production, probably much to the annoyance of the Chinese. They trade luxury goods. They trade, and apparently, by the way, the silk rivals the quality of Chinese silk, which is very much an accomplishment. So you have an economy that is, very oriented around luxury goods. They traded items like cloth and carpet. But the foundation is still the peasantry. And like the Roman Empire, they don't give food for free like the Romans do, but they keep food prices low to basically ensure that the peasants are happy and not, starving to death. Ironically, for a society that was very dependent upon trade, the Eastern Roman Empire really didn't esteem merchants very much. So they're much more similar to the Chinese than to their Islamic neighbors to the south. They don't treat merchants as badly as the Chinese do, but sort of similar. Okay, so we've talked about the economy, we've talked about culture. Now we're going to talk about the Great Divorce, the Great Schism. So the Great Schism, as we said, it happens in 1054, which is, nearly 500 years, probably over 500 years since the since the collapse of the Western Roman Empire and the emergence of the Roman Catholic Church under the Pope. So breakups generally don't come out of nowhere. They are not a singular event, they are a process. You can take this advice and apply it to your personal lives, or you can just apply it to history. But I think in both cases it's true. Breakups don't come from out of the blue, they're a process. So the split between the Roman Catholic Church and the Eastern Orthodox or Greek Orthodox Church is several hundred years in the making. So there's a division here. So in the West, it's kind of perceived that, in the West, we call Western Europe Christendom. This idea that European states, they might fight against each other, war against each other. They're still united by a common Christian identity. And they all generally acknowledge the supremacy of the Roman Catholic Church under the Pope. In the Eastern Roman Empire, you have that idea of Caesaropapism, where it's the emperor that really runs the show, runs the church, and basically all of the priests, all of the patriarchs, they're following what the Roman emperor says to do. Also, like those are big picture issues. But then if you even get to points like, for example, clerical celibacy, can priests marry? In the Roman Catholic Church, the answer is yes. Priests have to be celibate. In the Eastern Orthodox Church, no. When they celebrate Eucharist, you have changes that might seem inconsequential to some of you, but the idea is that the bread is unleavened. In the Eastern Orthodox Church, the bread is leavened. In the Roman Catholic Church, the Bible is in Latin and generally is inaccessible to ordinary people. They rely upon their local people rely upon their priests to basically provide them with the religious instruction that they need. Whereas in the Eastern Orthodox world, well, it's in Greek, which is inaccessible if you are not a Greek speaker, but the official language of the empire is Greek. So the influence of in the West, I mean, it's Roman law, and in the Eastern Roman, I don't like this necessarily because it implies that Roman law isn't an influence in the East. But we talked about the fact that Roman law gets modified and extended with Justinian's code. But also you have Greek philosophy, and remember, basically everybody who had copies of Greek philosophical works were going crazy over Greek ethics, Greek moralists, Socrates, Aristotle, Plato, and so on. We talked about how that was a big deal even in non-Greek cultures like Dar al-Islam. Whereas, as you might imagine, in Greek culture, Greek philosophy is a pretty big deal. So a lot of the laws and a lot of the ethical systems are sort of supported by this foundation of Greek philosophy. So in 1054, it's perfectly obvious by now that the two churches are separate in basically every major way, but that separation becomes much more formalized when the two leaders of the respective churches decide to demonstrate their maturity and their beneficence, and they promptly excommunicate each other. Patriarch Michael excommunicates Pope Leo IX. Pope Leo IX excommunicates Patriarch Michael, and this couple's breakup is known as the Great Schism. And so from this point onward, Christendom is divided in two. You have the Greek or Eastern Orthodox Church in the Byzantine Empire and to a certain extent beyond, and you have the Roman Catholic Church in Western Europe. So, like we said, we had this period after or during the reign of Justinian where it looked like the Eastern Romans were going to reunify the Roman Empire. And then you had the plagues happen, then it was determined that it was impossible to really defend Italy in the long term. And shortly after the death of Justinian, you have the emergence of Islam, which changes only everything. So the Rashidun Caliphate basically moves north, and it starts attacking both the Eastern Roman Empire and the Persian Empire. And in 717, they make it all the way to the walls of Constantinople. Now, the trump card that the Eastern Romans could always play is the fact that in order to take the city, you needed boats, especially when you're coming from this side, because Constantinople is on the European side of the Bosporus Straits. So in order to conquer the city, you need ships. So, and here's where the Byzantines truly excelled. They had a super weapon called Greek fire, where they basically used some kind of chemical mixture that essentially ignited when it made contact with water. Essentially, they have a frickin' flamethrower that they can use to devastate enemy fleets. This was kind of like the super weapon of the time period. Like, for hundreds of years, nobody could really answer the Byzantine use of Greek fire. So this is one of those rare cases where military technology really is totally decisive. Like, as powerful as the caliphates could be, they could not successfully overcome the basic problem of gaining control of the straits of the Bosphorus Straits. That being said, let's just say that the Eastern Roman Empire has not just a few bad years, but a few really rough centuries. Because it's not just one caliphate, it's multiple caliphates that come for the Eastern Roman Empire. The Eastern Roman Empire is able to recover after each invasion, but kind of just barely. So even after the Rashidun Caliphate, even after the Umayyad Caliphate, you have the migration of other people into the Middle East, including, remember, those Seljuk Turks. We mentioned that when the Seljuk Turks come in the middle of the 11th century, shortly after the Great Schism, the Seljuks fight the Byzantines at the Battle of Manzikert, and just absolutely annihilate the Byzantine army. It's sometimes said the Byzantine army never really fully recovers after this battle. But the fact is that most of Anatolia is lost to the Byzantine Empire for a very long period of time. This is actually what leads to Emperor Alexius, whom we talked about, writing that letter to Pope Urban II asking for help, which eventually comes in the form of the Crusades. But the Byzantine Empire just never quite regains its full strength after this. So I probably got a little ahead of myself because I have a whole slide apparently on Byzantine decline. So would you know, 1071, it talks about the Battle of Manzikert. The other thing that happens is the emergence of independent states in the Balkans, in basically the Byzantine Empire's backyard. So you see the emergence of a Bulgarian empire, like right near Constantinople. You see the emergence of a Serbia, and of course this diminishes Byzantine power. So they break away from Byzantine control and oftentimes war with the Byzantine Empire. The other thing that happens in 1204 is something else we talked about. The Crusaders, and more specifically the Venetians, they pull a scumbag move. They're stopping in Constantinople on the way to carry out one of many crusades. And they decide that, crusading is just a lot of hard work, and crusades are supposed to, carry out God's judgment on, non-Catholics, I suppose. And, they realize that there are plenty of non-Catholics in the city of Constantinople, and they take the city. Not only do they take the city, they actually rule it for a protracted time period, and they call it the Latin Empire. Eventually, Byzantine elites will, in sort of like the provinces, will rise up and retake the city. But if things are really bad before 1204, they're catastrophic afterwards. So there are a whole host of factors that kind of contribute to these disasters. Some of them are, quite frankly, outside of the empire's control. Again, the Crusaders sort of betraying them like this was, I don't know, probably not reasonable to anticipate. But, and of course, like we said, you have successive waves of, invaders that are predominantly Islamic, but they're also pretty diverse. You have Arabic caliphates. We also talked about the Seljuk Sultanate. There are Turkic people. The other thing that's happening is, you could almost call it sort of poetic justice. The Eastern Roman Empire is facing extensive competition from the merchant states that are emerging in Italy. So this would be, Venice, Florence, Genoa. These are states that are going to take the lead in sort of creating the Renaissance. Now, these states are, directly competing economically with Constantinople. Now, the reason I call it poetic justice is that if you remember, Constantinople was seen as being very attractive because it was a much more mercantile city than Rome and the other cities on the Italian peninsula during the time period of the Roman Empire. So a lot of Rome's economic base migrates to Constantinople. What we're kind of seeing is the reversal of that, where increasingly a large amount of economic activity starts to be centered on the Italian peninsula. So that's one thing. The other thing is that the Eastern Roman Empire increasingly has to kind of rely on almost like a type of feudalism the later in the empire's existence you get to. Now, this means that you have more power wielded by local elites. It also means that the very centralized bureaucracy that ran most of the empire gets gradually hollowed out, especially after 1204. You have an increase in taxes, but you also have an increase in income inequality. You have, and to a certain extent, that increase in power in the upper classes, these sort of aristocrats and provincial elites. That comes at the expense of the emperor and the imperial bureaucracy. Just like in the Roman Empire, you have a series of weak emperors, and if in the height of the Roman Empire's power, you could afford to have weak emperors. It's kind of amazing when you think about it that Rome has periods where you have a succession of weak emperors, or ineffective ones. Caligula, Nero, they come within like a generation of each other. In fact, there was, the period of Emperor Nero's death. You actually have a succession of 4 Roman emperors, and they're all kind of like trying to kill each other. And yet, despite all that chaos, that doesn't seriously impede or affect the empire's status as a superpower. By the time you get to the Byzantine Empire, though, the imperial system requires a competent emperor. And unfortunately, and not just a competent emperor, but a very effective one. And so if you didn't get effective emperors that were capable of taking the field and winning battles, well, basically, you're cooked. So in the 12 to 1300s, you see the migration of yet another group of Turkic peoples led by a figure by the name of Osman. And it's on the basis of that name that we have the Ottoman Turks. So the Ottoman Turks are Turkic, much like the Seljuks, except they migrate sort of towards the Middle East much later on. Now, they start pushing in on the Byzantine Empire. They sort of take away large sections of central Anatolia. They cross the Aegean Sea and actually invade bits and pieces of Greece. And they start to sort of surround the city of Constantinople, or at least the area around Constantinople. So one thing that the Ottomans, we can kind of consider the Ottomans as being, is they are one of the first, if not the first, gunpowder empire. These are, as the name suggests, empires that not only have discovered gunpowder, but use gunpowder and gunpowder-based armies as a way to project power. Now, the thing that has always been a problem with any enemy of Constantinople is, of course, well, not the Hagia Sophia in general, but the fact that Constantinople is a very well-developed, double-walled city. So this was almost impossible to take in a conventional siege because, again, you have these massive walls, and Constantinople can be supplied by sea. Well, if you got cannons, well, that's not as much of a concern. Primitive cannons were just now coming into their own, but they were basically commanded by specials, by mercenaries who manufactured these cannons and knew how to operate them. There weren't that many people in either Europe or Asia who knew how to do that. There was a Hungarian group who actually offered their services to the Byzantine emperor, offering basically to provide him with cannon-based defenses. But the Byzantine emperor looked at the price tag and decided that it was far too much. This was probably a very poor decision, and actually one of the last decisions of the Byzantine emperor, because they realized that the competition is willing to pay a lot more, and so these Hungarian cannoneers go to work for the Ottoman Turks, led by Sultan Mehmed II. So Mehmed II surrounds Constantinople and tries to take it in 1453. If you're a fan of epic last stands, so for example, Thermopylae, the Alamo, and so on, the Siege of Constantinople is definitely one of those moments. The wall is quickly penetrated by these cannonballs. Ottoman Turks flood in, and there's actually a last-ditch effort led by the emperor himself. I think it's John Pelagius, who rides out not with his imperial regalia, but in the armor of a common soldier, to save the city. They ride out knowing they're sort of doomed, but trying to, last as long as possible. Now, for that effort, for that doomed effort, he later on is canonized as a saint in the Eastern Orthodox Church. But it doesn't stop the inevitable. The Ottoman Turks managed to take the city, and they rechristen it Istanbul. And in fact, in a lot of respects, you see a lot of continuation of Byzantine imperial practice in the Ottoman Empire. To a certain extent, it's in the name itself. So one of the titles of the Ottoman Sultan was the Sultan of Rum, R-U-M, which is actually a Turkish rendering of the name Rome. So as far as the Turks themselves were concerned, they were the successors to the Roman Empire. They just happened to be Turkish as opposed to Greek. By the way, here is the Eastern Roman Empire at sort of its end life. So it just has a little tiny sliver of land around Constantinople. Like, it's kind of adorable, except it's about to be absolutely annihilated. And it has some land in the Peloponnesus, like where Sparta used to be. Always a good omen when you occupy territory that is the heartland of an old collapsed empire. So in that respect, it's kind of amazing that the Eastern Roman Empire lasts as long as it does, over 1,000 years. After, it's established by Constantine, I think in 324 CE, it lasts until 1453 CE. So let's kind of take a look at what happens afterwards. So the Ottoman Turks were fairly tolerant religiously. Your individual results may vary, of course, but the fact is that for much of the Greek-speaking population of Turkey, Greece, and the Balkans, life continued as it did before. There was a slow but steady conversion to Islam, sometimes motivated by a desire to be exempt from the jizya, the tax levied on non-Muslims. To a certain extent, it was to ingratiate themselves to the new regime. And of course, the fact that in the grand scheme of things, Islam doesn't seem dramatically different from Eastern Orthodox Christianity. However, many Byzantines do flee the city of Constantinople. I mean, the question is, where do you go? Well, one of the closest locations is, of course, the Italian peninsula. Now, the long-term effect of this is that these Greek-speaking Byzantines, not only do they bring themselves, but they also bring lots of their possessions, including some of the classics that have been, sort of inaccessible to many Italians, many Europeans. So this is 1453. One of the things that we associate with this period called the Renaissance is this greater emphasis on the classics from Greece and Rome, and sort of like this rebirth of the classical world. Well, this is one of the things that really stimulates the Renaissance, this slow migration out of the Eastern Roman Empire, and the fact that the classics are sort of brought out of the world of Eastern Europe and into Western Europe. Something that connects the civilizations that we've talked about pretty extensively so far, whether you're looking at India or Dar al-Islam, or eventually feudal Europe, and of course the Eastern Roman Empire, is that religion plays a fundamental role in bringing these states together. Sometimes it can be in a very obvious way, like the Eastern Roman Emperor claiming to be both the head of the state and the head of the church. Sometimes it's providing like a common culture or language, like we talked about how Arabization and Islam go hand in hand. But the significance of the Eastern Roman Empire, it endures. Not necessarily in the lands occupied by the Ottoman Turks, but beyond them. The idea of Rome is maintained and preserved in other parts of the Orthodox world. And that's where we'll turn tomorrow, to Russia.